The first mistake people make with Project 2025 is assuming it is some internet rumor, some exaggerated talking point, some political ghost story designed to scare people who never read past a headline. It is not. Project 2025 is real, public, organized, and detailed. At the center of it is a massive policy book called Mandate for Leadership 2025, The Conservative Promise, produced through the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 effort with the help of a broad coalition of conservative groups. Reuters described it as a roughly 900-page book of policy proposals, while the BBC called it a 900-page policy wish list for a new conservative administration. That matters because once a thing is written down this clearly, we are no longer dealing with vibes. We are dealing with an agenda. And this is where the conversation gets serious for Black America and for the Black church. Too often, our communities are expected to react to policy after it is already moving through agencies, schools, courtrooms, and payroll systems. By then, the language has been sanitized, the headlines have moved on, and the harm is already being felt at the kitchen table. But this time, the blueprint is sitting in plain sight. Heritage's own document lays out a vision for stronger presidential control over the executive branch, a restructuring of federal agencies, a rollback of civil service protections, and the installation of more ideologically aligned personnel across government. In other words, this is not just a list of beliefs. It is a plan about who will hold power, how they will use it, and which restraints they believe should be removed. That is why this subject cannot be dismissed as ordinary campaign noise. Reuters reported in July 2024 that although Donald Trump publicly said he knew nothing about Project 2025, many of his close policy allies were deeply involved in it. Then Reuters reported again in December 2024 that several figures associated with Project 2025 were tied to Trump's incoming administration, including Russ Vought, Tom Homan, Brendan Carr, and John Ratcliffe. So the honest reading is not that every line of the document automatically becomes law, and not that every political actor owns every page of it word for word. The honest reading is that the overlap between the blueprint and real governing personnel is too significant to ignore. And if anybody is tempted to say, well, think tanks write papers all the time, that is true. But not every think tank document arrives with this level of institutional ambition. According to Reuters, Project 2025 was not only about policy papers. Participants were also assembling lists of people who could be placed throughout government and preparing executive orders and agency actions that could be used quickly. The BBC likewise reported that the project included strategies for implementation, including training and staffing pipelines. That changes the feel of the whole thing. This is not just philosophy. This is infrastructure. It is one thing to dream about power. It is another thing to pre-package power so it can move on day one. And that brings us to the deeper spiritual issue. Scripture warns us in Isaiah 10, 1-2, "Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that right grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people." Notice the language. The prophet is not only rebuking violent men in the street, he is rebuking written decrees, encoded injustice, power that hides itself in official language. That is part of why this moment should ring familiar to Bible readers, and especially to Black believers whose history in America has so often involved surviving policies long before surviving public apologies. The issue is not simply whether a document sounds conservative. The issue is whether written policy can be used to weaken protections, narrow opportunity, and harden the hand of power against vulnerable people. Even the way major civil liberties groups describe the project shows why people are paying close attention. The ACLU says Project 2025 is a blueprint for radically restructuring the executive branch and dismantling guardrails that prevent presidential abuse of power. Now, that is the ACLU's framing, not neutral government language, so we should be fair about that. But the concern itself is grounded in the document's own emphasis on centralizing authority and remaking agencies around a more aggressive executive vision. In other words, the alarm is not coming out of nowhere. It is being drawn from what the blueprint openly says it wants to do. So before anybody jumps too fast to slogans, we need to slow down and say this carefully. Is Project 2025 by itself already a proven machine that has accomplished everything its authors want? No. Is every warning about it equally strong and equally supported? Also no. Some claims are stronger than others, and some parts of the agenda would face legal or congressional barriers. But is it fair to say the document is real, the network behind it is real, the staffing ambition is real, the overlap with real political power is real, and the stakes are serious enough that Black America should pay attention before the decisions arrive dressed up as normal governance? Absolutely. Because once policy becomes personnel, and personnel becomes enforcement, and enforcement becomes everyday life, the people most affected are usually not the ones who wrote the blueprint, ones who they are the families living under it. And that is where this story stops being abstract. The next question is not whether Project 2025 exists. It does. The next question is why so many Black scholars, Black advocates, and civil rights voices are warning that when this kind of agenda hits the ground, Black America could feel the impact first and hardest. If you want to understand why this conversation hits Black America differently, you have to move past the surface level of party politics and look at where policy actually lands, because policy does not fall on blank ground. It falls on communities with history, communities with scars, communities with patterns of exclusion that did not disappear just because the language got cleaner. And that is why a document like Project 2025 cannot be measured only by what its authors say they intend. It also has to be measured by who is most exposed when protections are weakened, when agencies are restructured, when enforcement is scaled back, and when public systems that many families rely on are suddenly treated like obstacles instead of lifelines. That is the part of this story some people still do not want to face. Black America has never had the luxury of pretending that government is irrelevant. Government wrote the maps. Government drew the districts. Government enforced the laws unevenly. Government decided which schools were starved, which neighborhoods were redlined, which jobs were opened, which loans were denied, which bodies were over-policed, and which communities had to fight just to be seen as fully protected under the Constitution. So when a modern policy blueprint talks openly about reducing civil rights enforcement, dismantling parts of the federal workforce, reshaping education, rewriting agency priorities, and weakening equity-based protections, Black Americans do not hear that as abstract theory. We hear the echo of history, and serious Black institutions are saying exactly that. The Legal Defense Fund's Thurgood Marshall Institute released a report warning that Project 2025 could severely harm Black communities across 7 major areas: civil rights and equal opportunity, education, Black political participation, the criminal legal system, housing, reproductive justice, and environmental justice. That matters because this is not just one emotional reaction or one social media thread. This is a legal and civil rights analysis from an institution rooted in the long Black freedom struggle. The report's warning is not that every page uses anti-Black language explicitly. The warning is that the proposed changes, taken together, could roll back systems and protections that Black communities have had to fight to secure over generations. The NAACP raised a similar alarm. In its own resolution, the organization argued that Project 2025 threatens to reverse decades of progress in civil rights, social justice, healthcare, education, criminal justice, and environmental protection, with disproportionate harm to African Americans and other marginalized communities. Again, that is an advocacy judgment, and we should say that plainly, but it is not a random one. It is grounded in the fact that when federal protections shrink, the burden does not fall evenly across all populations. Communities already living with wealth gaps, health disparities, school inequities, housing instability, and voter suppression pressure usually feel the blow first. Now bring that down from the national level to everyday life. One reason this matters so much is that Black Americans are deeply tied to the very federal structures that Project 2025 talks about reshaping. According to a profile of the 2023 federal workforce, nearly 19% of federal workers identified as Black, compared with 13% of the U.S. labor force overall. That is not a small detail. That means the federal government has been, for many Black families, not just a distant institution in Washington, but a real source of employment, stability, benefits, advancement, and middle-class footing. And when you start talking about rolling back civil service protections, making it easier to fire career employees, or rebuilding agencies around political loyalty, you are not just talking about bureaucracy, you are talking about mortgages, tuition, prescriptions, and retirement plans in Black households across the country. And the significance becomes even sharper when you look at Black women. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission found that in the federal workforce, Black women made up 12.1% of workers, compared with 6.6% of the civilian labor force. In plain language, Black women are represented in federal employment at nearly double their share of the broader labor market. That means when the federal workforce is destabilized, Black women are not standing at a safe distance watching policy happen to somebody else. They are often standing right in the line of impact. And because Black women so often anchor families, churches, caregiving networks, and community economics, the shock does not stop with one employee. It travels through households and entire support systems. That is why this issue cannot be reduced to who wins a cable news argument. For some people, shrinking government sounds philosophical. For Black communities, it can become personal very fast. If civil rights enforcement is weakened, the question is not theoretical. It is whether discrimination becomes harder to challenge. If education systems are restructured, the question is whether Black students lose already fragile protections and opportunities. If housing programs are pushed downward into uneven state systems, the question is whether Black families in places with ugly histories of discrimination face even less security. If healthcare and reproductive policy shifts become more punitive, the question is whether Black mothers and Black families absorb the consequences while others debate ideology from a distance. And that is one of the deepest misunderstandings in American political discourse. People often talk as if all communities encounter public policy from the same starting line. We do not. Black America carries the memory of being excluded from New Deal benefits, targeted by urban renewal, trapped by segregated schooling, penalized by discriminatory lending, overexposed to punitive policing, and repeatedly forced to rely on federal intervention when local power refused justice. So, when a new blueprint proposes weakening some of those federal guardrails, the fear is not irrational. It is historical. It is pattern recognition. That is where the biblical lens becomes so important. In Exodus, the pressure on the people did not begin with chains alone. It began with policy. Pharaoh looked at a people, judged them as a threat, and then used state power to manage, burden, and contain them. He reorganized labor. He increased pressure. He weaponized administration. He turned governance into domination. Now, to be clear, we should not flatten every modern policy dispute into a one-to-one Bible prophecy. That would be careless. But Exodus gives us a serious spiritual framework for understanding how power can move against a people through systems long before it moves through open violence. And Black Christians know that pattern in their bones. So when we ask why Black America should care, the answer is not because somebody used dramatic language online. The answer is because the communities most reliant on fair enforcement, stable public employment, educational access, voting protections, housing safeguards, and health support are the same communities that have historically been forced to fight the hardest for those things. What some people call government excess, others know as the only barrier that once stood between their family and open exclusion. That is why this moment requires more than outrage. It requires memory. It requires discernment. It requires the Black church, Black civic institutions, and ordinary Black families to read policy with the same seriousness that previous generations read poll taxes, literacy tests, zoning maps, sentencing laws, and school board decisions. Because danger does not always announce itself with a slur. Sometimes it arrives in official language, with administrative polish, wrapped in arguments about efficiency, order, tradition, or freedom. And once you understand that, the next question becomes even more urgent. If Black America is especially vulnerable, not just because of rhetoric, but because of where we sit inside the actual machinery of the state, then what happens when that machinery is deliberately pulled under tighter political control from the top down? The most dangerous part of Project 2025 may not be any single culture war headline. It may be the quieter ambition underneath the whole document. Power first. Before you get to the arguments about schools, abortion, policing, or federal programs, you run into something even deeper, a plan to pull more control toward the top of the executive branch and make the machinery of government answer more directly to the president and his chosen loyalists. That is not a paranoid reading. It is one of the defining themes of the document itself. In the Heritage Blueprint, the language is blunt. The document argues that the next conservative president must take firmer command of the executive branch, direct agencies more aggressively, and stop what the authors describe as an autonomous or unaccountable bureaucracy. Reuters reported that Project 2025 calls for a broad expansion of presidential power, including increasing the president's authority over the Justice Department and boosting the number of political appointees in government. The BBC likewise reported that the project proposes placing the federal bureaucracy, including agencies long expected to maintain some independence, under direct presidential control through a more aggressive understanding of executive authority. That means the goal here is not just different policy outcomes. It is a different power structure. And if that sounds dry, it should not. Because whenever power is concentrated, the first question should always be, concentrated to do what? In this case, the Heritage document speaks openly about the need for a trained, aligned, ready-to-go cadre of conservatives who can move quickly on day one. In other words, this is not merely about elections. It is about personnel. It is about reducing the ability of career civil servants to slow, moderate, or resist the president's ideological agenda. The document explicitly praises the idea of making it easier to remove certain federal employees and replacing them with people more committed to the administration's goals. That is why terms like Schedule F became so significant in these debates. The issue is not just staffing. The issue is whether professional expertise and legal guardrails give way to political obedience. The ACLU, from its civil liberties perspective, warns that Project 2025 is designed to dismantle guardrails that prevent abuse of executive power. That is advocacy language, and viewers should recognize it as such. But the concern maps onto something real in the document structure. If you increase the president's direct control over agencies, weaken job protections for career officials, and install more ideological appointees across the system, then the practical result is a government that becomes more personal, more centralized, and more sensitive to the will of one administration at one moment in time. The old restraints may have been frustrating to some conservatives, but restraints are often frustrating precisely because they restrain. This is where Black historical memory becomes crucial. Black Americans have often had an uneasy, double-sided relationship with the federal government. On one hand, federal power has been used to surveil, criminalize, and neglect Black communities. Nobody serious should romanticize the state. But on the other hand, federal structures and federal enforcement have also sometimes been the only counterweight when local systems were openly hostile. It was federal action that helped break some school segregation. Federal civil rights law mattered when local courts would not protect us. Federal employment opened doors that much of the private sector kept closed or only half open. So when a project proposes remaking the federal apparatus around more direct political control, Black America has reason to ask not just whether power is being made efficient, but whether it is being made less accountable to law, rights, and long-term institutional standards. That is why the workforce piece matters so much. According to a profile of the 2023 federal workforce, Black workers made up 19% of the federal workforce, higher than their share of the overall U.S. labor force. The same source notes that many workers of color are concentrated in lower and entry-level positions, where they can be especially vulnerable to restructuring and instability. The EEOC also found that Black women were especially represented in federal employment compared with the civilian labor force. So when civil service protections are weakened, this is not some abstract war between bureaucrats and populists. It can become a direct shock to Black employment, Black household stability, and the fragile middle-class footing many families built through public sector work. And there is another layer to this that should not be missed. Once a president gains greater leverage over agencies and personnel, that power does not stay locked in an abstract constitutional debate. It flows outward. It shapes how rules are interpreted, which complaints are taken seriously, which cases are pursued, which offices are defunded, which definitions are erased, and which communities are treated as deserving of protection. Centralized power is never just a theory. It becomes enforcement priorities. It becomes hiring decisions. It becomes silence in one office and aggression in another. It becomes the difference between a complaint that gets investigated and a complaint that gets buried. That is why this conversation naturally calls up the book of Daniel. Daniel is a book about empire, about what happens when power at the top expects conformity below. Babylon was not dangerous only because it had armies. Babylon was dangerous because it had systems. It renamed people. It trained them. It reorganized reality around the will of the empire. It tried to make loyalty to power feel normal, inevitable, even wise. And again, we do not need to abuse Scripture by pretending every modern policy manual is a direct prophetic fulfillment. But Daniel does give us a lens for understanding how centralized political power works on the soul of a society. It pressures conscience. It rewards compliance. It narrows the space for moral resistance. That is why Black Christians especially should pay attention whenever government is being redesigned around tighter ideological command. Our history teaches us that when powerful institutions become more insulated from accountability, marginalized people usually do not get more room to breathe. They get less. What is marketed as order can become control. What is marketed as streamlining can become purging. What is marketed as presidential strength can become institutional intimidation. And the fairness point matters here too. Not every proposal in Project 2025 is equally likely to become reality. Some would face court fights. Some would require Congress. Some may be softened, stalled, or defeated. We should say that openly because credibility matters, but the existence of legal obstacles does not erase the significance of the ambition. If a blueprint repeatedly returns to the idea that the president should command the bureaucracy more fully, remove obstructive personnel, and reshape agencies according to a disciplined ideological mission, then we are looking at a serious effort to change not only what government does, but what government is. So the real warning here is not just that policies may change. Policies always change. The warning is that the very channels through which ordinary people seek fairness could become more politicized, more selective, and more hostile to claims that inconvenience power. And for Black America, that has never been a minor matter. Because when the state becomes more personalized at the top, the people at the bottom often find out too late that what was called reform was really a struggle over who gets protected, who gets heard, and who gets sacrificed in the name of a new order. And once you understand that, you can see why the next battlefield would never stay confined to job protections and executive theory. The next battlefield is civil rights itself, because once power is gathered more tightly into fewer hands, the urgent question becomes this: what happens when that power starts redefining justice, equality, and the very meaning of discrimination? The Bible does not allow us to pretend otherwise. Isaiah 58 rebukes the kind of religion that loves the appearance of devotion while neglecting the bonds of wickedness and the burdens crushing actual people. Micah 6:8 does not ask the people of God merely to hold correct doctrine in private. It calls them to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Exodus is not only a story about supernatural deliverance, it is a story about the God who hears the cry of a burdened people under state power. Daniel is not only a story about personal piety in exile, it is a story about remaining faithful under empire without bowing to the image that power erects. And Black church history has always read those texts with skin in the game. Our people did not cling to Exodus because it was literary. They clung to it because they knew what it meant to cry by reason of bondage. They did not cling to Daniel because it was dramatic. They clung to it because they understood the pressure to conform to a hostile order. They did not shout about justice in the prophets because it sounded poetic. They shouted because they knew what it meant to live in a land where law and righteousness could be miles apart. So when institutions like the Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP warn that Project 2025 could damage Black communities across civil rights, education, political participation, housing, healthcare, and environmental justice, the Black church should not hear that as optional background noise. It should hear it as part of the burden of pastoral awareness. It should hear it as a reminder that policy is one of the places where love of neighbor either becomes concrete or gets reduced to slogans. And to be clear, this does not mean the church should become a wing of any party. The Black church loses its power when it baptizes politicians uncritically. It loses its witness when it trades prophecy for access. But it also loses its witness when it refuses to speak while systems are being rearranged in ways that may deepen harm for the very people it is called to serve. There is a difference between partisanship and moral clarity. There is a difference between campaigning and warning. There is a difference between endorsing a platform and refusing to let your people walk blind into a storm. The hardest truth may be this: when public systems are weakened, the Black church is often expected to absorb the fallout. When schools fail, the church tutors. When families are unstable, the church counsels. When wages are thin, the church feeds. When grief floods the community, the church buries. When young people feel erased, the church tries to remind them who they are. That work is holy, but it is also costly, and it becomes even more costly when policy choices increase the pressure on communities already stretched thin. That is why spiritual leadership in this hour means more than emotional preaching. It means teaching people how power works. It means helping saints understand that policies are not morally neutral simply because they are technical. It means reminding believers that stewardship includes civic awareness, that prayer does not cancel preparation, and that discernment includes learning how official decisions shape the lives of ordinary people. So the question before the Black church is not whether it should become political in the shallow sense. The real question is whether it will remain prophetic in the deep sense. Will it recognize danger while there is still time to teach, organize, pray, inform, and prepare? Will it help people think beyond personalities and pay attention to structures? Will it remember that empires often reshape life gradually through policy and administration, while exhausted people are told not to make a fuss? Because if the church cannot name what threatens the vulnerable, then somebody else will define the moment for us. And if the church will not help the people read the times, the people may be left to interpret national shifts only after the consequences have already arrived at their front door. That is why the next part of this conversation matters so much. We have to be strong without becoming reckless. We have to be urgent without becoming dishonest. We have to tell the truth about what Project 2025 is, and also tell the truth about what we can and cannot say with certainty. At this point in the story, credibility becomes a spiritual issue. Because when people are afraid, they become vulnerable not only to real danger, but to exaggeration, distortion, and theatrical certainty. And if this conversation is going to help anybody, we have to draw a clean line between what Project 2025 actually says, what outside critics infer from it, what has already shown signs of overlap with real governing behavior, and what still remains uncertain. If we fail to make those distinctions, then even a serious warning can start sounding like propaganda. So let's slow down and say it plainly. First, what is certain? It is certain that Project 2025 is a real Heritage Foundation-led transition effort. It is certain that its central policy volume is roughly 900 pages long. It is certain that the document explicitly argues for stronger presidential control over the executive branch, changes to the civil service, elimination or rollback of DEI infrastructure, major shifts in civil rights enforcement, aggressive changes in education policy, and deep restructuring across federal agencies. Those are not rumors. Those are documented features of the published blueprint. Second, it is also certain that Donald Trump publicly distanced himself from Project 2025 during the 2024 campaign. Reuters reported that Trump said he knew nothing about the project and disagreed with some of its ideas. That matters. We should not pretend he openly endorsed the entire thing line by line, because he did not. But Reuters also documented substantial overlap between the project and Trump world personnel. Later, Reuters reported in December 2024 that several people tied to Project 2025 were connected to his incoming administration, including Russ Vought, Tom Homan, Brendan Carr, and John Ratcliffe. So the most honest summary is neither total separation nor total identity. It is overlap, meaningful overlap, but not perfect overlap. Third, some of the strongest warnings about Black impact come from civil rights and advocacy institutions, not from the Project 2025 authors themselves. The Legal Defense Fund argues that the plan would severely harm Black communities across civil rights, education, political participation, criminal justice, housing, reproductive justice, and environmental justice. The NAACP argues that the plan threatens to reverse decades of progress for Black communities. Those are serious warnings, and they deserve attention, especially because they come from organizations with deep Black institutional memory. But we should still present them accurately as analyses and warnings, not as neutral government verdicts or official confessions from heritage. Fourth, some critics move too quickly from proposal to inevitability. That is not always justified. Brookings, for example, notes that several major education proposals associated with Project 2025 would require substantial congressional cooperation and may face real political resistance. That means not every big-ticket item can be treated as an automatic certainty. Courts matter, Congress matters, bureaucratic resistance matters, political backlash matters, timing matters. A published ambition is not the same thing as a completed outcome, but here is where people make the opposite mistake. They hear that some proposals may be difficult to implement, and then they relax as if the whole blueprint can be dismissed. That would also be careless. BBC reported in February 2025 that several early Trump administration moves closely tracked themes found in Project 2025, especially around the federal workforce, DEI, and executive posture. In other words, you do not need the entire document implemented in full for the project to matter. Sometimes the deepest influence of a blueprint is directional rather than total. It changes priorities, it shapes personnel, it normalizes a vocabulary, it sets the horizon of what people with power believe they should attempt. So what should we not say? We should not say every sentence in the document is guaranteed to become law. We should not say every conservative official is equally tied to every Project 2025 proposal. We should not say every warning about Black America has been legally proven in advance. We should not say every current event is direct evidence of some hidden master plan. And we definitely should not use prophecy language recklessly as if we have a private hotline to God's timetable and can turn every policy fight into an infallible prediction. But what can we say? Strongly and honestly, We can say that this blueprint contains explicit proposals to weaken or redirect institutions that Black Americans have historically depended on for protection, access, employment, and civic participation. We can say the document reflects a serious effort to consolidate executive power and reshape federal agencies around an ideological vision. We can say Black civil rights organizations have warned with detail and urgency that the likely consequences would fall heavily on Black communities. We can say there is enough overlap between this blueprint and real political power to make the danger more than theoretical. And we can say that dismissing the whole matter as internet fear-mongering is no longer a serious response. This is where discernment matters more than drama. Jeremiah lived in a time when people wanted easy reassurance. They wanted somebody to tell them peace, when deeper instability was already spreading through the nation. The faithful response was not panic, but truthful warning, not hysteria, but sobriety, not silence, but courage. That is the posture we need here. We do not need more algorithmic sensationalism. We need moral seriousness anchored in fact. Because if we overstate the case, people may tune out before they hear the real warning. But if we understate the case, people may drift into danger while telling themselves everything is normal. The balance is difficult, but necessary. We have to speak in a way that is sharp enough to wake people up and honest enough to keep their trust. And that leads straight to the final question. If Project 2025 is not simply a proven finished machine, but also not an empty scare story, then what is it really? What is the truest way to name the threat without exaggerating it and without shrinking from what is plainly in front of us? So what is Project 2025 really? After all the noise, all the spin, all the campaign season messaging, all the online shouting, what is the clearest, truthful answer? It is not best described as a proven secret plot with every detail already guaranteed to happen. That would go too far. But it is also not a harmless stack of papers that people only mention for clicks. The strongest honest answer is this. Project 2025 is a documented governing blueprint that openly proposes major shifts in power, personnel, civil rights enforcement, education, social policy, and federal administration, and many of those shifts could land with special force on Black America. That is the sober conclusion. Not because the document uses the phrase, destroy Black America. It does not. Not because every critic says the same thing in the same way. They do not. And not because every proposal is equally likely to be enacted. They are not. The reason this remains serious is simpler and stronger than slogan. The blueprint explicitly targets institutional arrangements that have mattered greatly to Black life in America. Federal civil rights enforcement, public sector employment, education oversight, anti-discrimination frameworks, voting rights infrastructure, housing protections, health-related supports, and broader federal commitments to equity. When you place that beside the warnings from Black institutions, the picture sharpens. The Legal Defense Fund argues that Project 2025 threatens Black communities across civil rights, education, political participation, criminal justice, housing, reproductive justice, and environmental justice. The NAACP warns that the agenda could reverse decades of progress in social justice, healthcare, education, and civil rights with disproportionate harm to Black communities. Those are not light claims. They are not proof that every fear will materialize in full, but they are serious warnings from organizations that know what anti-Black rollback looks like when it changes vocabulary and enters respectable rooms. And the Black-specific concern is not imaginary. Black workers are overrepresented in the federal workforce. One profile of the 2023 federal workforce found that 19% of federal workers identified as Black, compared with 13% of the overall U.S. labor force. The EEOC found that Black women in particular have a much stronger presence in federal employment than in the civilian labor force. That means attacks on civil service protections and federal job stability are not race neutral in their likely impact. They could shake one of the very employment lanes through which black families have built relative security. The political context matters too. Reuters documented Trump's public effort to distance himself from Project 2025, but also reported real overlap between the project and figures surrounding his political world. Reuters later identified Project 2025 linked personnel in his incoming administration. BBC then reported that several early administration moves aligned with themes in the document. So the story is no longer just whether Trump signed his name on every page. The story is whether a policy architecture like this is close enough to real power to matter. The evidence says yes. So maybe the deepest way to say it is this. Project 2025 is not just about Republicans and Democrats. It is about whether the systems that black people have had to rely on, challenge, pressure, and sometimes painfully trust will be narrowed, repurposed, or hollowed out. It is about whether federal power will be used less as a guardrail against inequity and more as an instrument for ideological consolidation. It is about whether the language of fairness will be rewritten so tightly that structural harm becomes easier to deny. It is about whether communities already carrying historical weight will be told, once again, to survive the consequences quietly. This is why the biblical image of Babylon still has power. Babylon is not only a symbol of obvious evil. Babylon is organized power, dazzling power, official power, systematized power. It is the kind of order that asks people to bow while calling that bowing wisdom. It absorbs language, identity, labor, and imagination into itself. And the challenge for the faithful in Babylon was never merely to survive emotionally. It was to remain clear-minded, unbent in conscience, and rooted in covenant memory while living inside an empire that kept trying to redefine reality. That is where Black Christians have something vital to bring to this moment. Black faith has always had to learn how to read empire without worshiping it, how to identify danger without surrendering to despair, and how to resist dehumanization while still believing God is active in history. Black church memory is filled with people who read the signs of the times before respectable society was ready to admit the danger. They knew that the nation could preach liberty and still practice exclusion. They knew that legal language could be twisted. They knew that waiting too long to wake up came with a price. So no, we do not need to fake certainty. We do not need prophecy bait. We do not need cheap manipulation. But we do need vigilance. We need literacy. We need churches that teach, families that pay attention, creators who research, voters who discern, and communities that understand how policy becomes lived reality. We need to remember that not every threat announces itself through open hatred. Some threats arrive through restructuring, definitions, staffing, and official reforms that seem technical until the consequences become personal. In the end, the title question still stands, but now it stands on firmer ground. Could this 900-page blueprint become part of a broader plan that harms Black America in profound ways? Yes, that concern is real enough to take seriously. Is it responsible to say the danger is documented, the overlap with power is significant, and the likely fallout could reach Black jobs, Black schools, Black votes, Black health, Black housing, and Black dignity? Yes. That is a warning grounded in evidence, not fantasy. And if that is true, then the final response cannot be fear alone. It has to be remembrance, discernment, and action. Read what is written, watch who is appointed, follow what is enforced, teach your people, guard your soul, strengthen your community, and do not wait for the full weight of a system to land before deciding that what was happening was real all along. Once power is centralized, the next question is always what that power intends to protect and what it intends to strip away. That is where Project 2025 becomes especially serious for Black America, because one of the clearest through lines in the document is not just smaller government in some generic sense. It is a desire to rewrite the way civil rights are understood, enforced, and even named. And for a people whose survival in this country has depended again and again on hard-won legal protections being recognized and enforced, that is not a side issue. That is the heart of the alarm. The heritage document is explicit on several fronts. It calls for eliminating DEI language and infrastructure across the federal government. It argues against the use of disparate impact theory in civil rights enforcement. It urges major changes to the Department of Justice and related enforcement mechanisms. In plain English, disparate impact is one of the ways the law has recognized that discrimination is not always loud, personal, and confessed out of somebody's mouth. Sometimes a policy can look neutral on paper and still consistently harm a protected group in practice. Project 2025 pushes against that framework. The document also proposes ending or sharply curbing initiatives that treat equity as a legitimate federal concern. Those are not rumors or hostile paraphrases. Those are features visible in the blueprint itself. The Center for American Progress, analyzing the document, argued that Project 2025 would effectively stage an equity purge across parts of the federal government. Now that phrase is Kiap's interpretation, not the Heritage Foundation's wording, and it is important to be honest about the difference. But CAP also points to several explicit proposals in the text itself: defunding DEIA offices, limiting the EEOC's ability to issue guidance, blocking the collection of some race-based employment data, eliminating the Office of Federal Contract Compliance programs, and banning the use of disparate impact theory by executive order and legislation. Those are concrete changes. The interpretation is debated. The proposals are there, and if you want to know why this matters to Black Americans in particular, you have to remember how much of Black progress in modern America has depended on the law being willing to see structural discrimination, not just cartoonish bigotry. If the standard becomes prove explicit personal intent every time, then many forms of modern discrimination become harder to challenge. Housing patterns, school discipline patterns, hiring patterns, lending patterns, sentencing patterns, these things do not always come with a memo saying, "We intended to target Black people." Often the injury shows up in the outcome. That is why changes in enforcement theory are not just legal fine print. They can decide whether inequality is visible to the system or invisible by design. Then there is the Justice Department. Reuters reported that Project 2025 calls for increasing presidential authority over the DOJ, something that has alarmed law enforcement observers who worry about political interference. The Heritage Blueprint itself calls for major reforms to the department and criticizes the direction of existing civil rights enforcement. The Brennan Center goes further, arguing that Project 2025's election and voting proposals would weaken the DOJ Civil Rights Division, redirect civil rights enforcement away from its historic mission, and even use legal tools in ways that could target election officials who help voters. That matters deeply when you remember that some of the laws now being discussed were once used to protect Black citizens from organized efforts to block the Black vote. The Brennan Center's warning is analytical, not the project's self-description. But it is anchored in real recommendations the project makes about prosecution and institutional reorganization. That point should stop us for a moment, because one of the great achievements of the civil rights era was not simply passing laws on paper. It was building federal capacity to enforce those laws when states, counties, sheriffs, employers, and local systems refused to do right. The DOJ Civil Rights Division mattered. The Voting Rights Act mattered. Federal oversight mattered. Consent decrees mattered. Data collection mattered. Enforcement standards mattered. Those were not luxuries. They were tools built in response to real American resistance to Black freedom. So when a modern blueprint treats many of those tools as ideological contamination or bureaucratic overreach, Black audiences hear the warning clearly. We have seen this movie before. Remove the enforcement, and the promise of equal protection starts becoming decorative. This is why the LDF's warning carries such weight. The Legal Defense Fund's Thurgood Marshall Institute said Project 2025 threatens Black communities across civil rights, education, political participation, criminal justice, housing, reproductive justice, and environmental justice. One major concern in that analysis is the weakening of anti-discrimination laws and the cutting of worker protections, including barriers to collecting racial demographic data. If you stop gathering the data, if you narrow the legal definitions, and if you recast equity efforts as suspect, then inequity does not disappear. It just becomes easier to deny. And this is where the Black church must hear the moral dimension, not just the policy dimension. Because civil rights are not ultimately about abstractions. They are about whether image bearers of God can walk through society with dignity, access, safety, and equal standing before the law. When justice is narrowed so severely that only the most obvious offenses count, while broader patterns of exclusion are ignored, that is not moral neutrality. That is a decision about whose burdens matter enough to be seen. The biblical language for that kind of corruption is old. The prophets spoke of justice being twisted at the gate. They spoke of systems where the poor were denied judgment, where law was present but righteousness was absent. Jeremiah warned of a society where people cried peace while rot spread through the foundations. Amos spoke of those who turned justice into bitterness and cast righteousness to the ground. These texts matter because they remind us that injustice often survives by becoming procedural. It learns to speak in administrative language. It becomes respectable. It hides behind official process. That is why Project 2025 should not be read only as a list of hot-button issues. It should be read as a struggle over the moral imagination of the state. Will the government recognize structural harm, or only the kind of harm that power finds convenient to admit? Will federal agencies be allowed to protect vulnerable communities? Or will they be reorganized to challenge the very tools designed to widen opportunity? Will voting access be treated as a democratic good to be protected, or as a field of suspicion to be policed more aggressively? These are not secondary questions. They go to the meaning of citizenship itself. And to be fair, credibility requires one more reminder. It is possible to overstate things. Not every critic uses identical language. Not every proposal will survive legal challenge. Not every consequence is immediate. The words "destroy Black America" are rhetorical language, not a court finding or an official admission. But the core warning remains strong even after you remove exaggeration. This blueprint openly targets enforcement frameworks and institutional tools that Black Americans have relied on in the long struggle against discrimination. That alone makes it one of the most serious civil rights stories in the country. Because if the rules change, if the definitions narrow, if the data disappears, if the watchdogs are restrained, and if the agencies built to protect equal opportunity are redirected against the very idea of equity, then injustice does not have to announce itself with old segregation signs. It can operate through cleaner language and sharper suits. It can call itself reform while rolling back the practical meaning of civil rights. And once the audience sees that, the next revelation hits even closer to home. Because this is not only about courtrooms, agencies, and legal theory. When civil rights enforcement is weakened, the fallout does not stay in Washington. It moves into schools, hospitals, housing offices, family budgets, and everyday Black life. The danger of a policy blueprint like Project 2025 is that people hear the words and imagine a debate happening somewhere far away, in Washington offices, think tank conferences, and cable news panels. But policy never stays in those rooms. It travels. It moves through schools, clinics, housing offices, payroll systems, food budgets, and family decisions. And that is why Section 5 matters so much. Because once you move beyond the language of executive power and civil rights theory, you start to see the everyday fallout. You start to see how a document can change the texture of ordinary life. Take education first, because education is always one of the first places where a nation reveals what kind of future it wants. Reuters reported that Project 2025 proposes eliminating the Department of Education. The BBC also identified abolishing the department as one of the project's major proposals, alongside broader school choice expansion and anti-DEI measures. Brookings, reviewing the education chapter, described the agenda as a drastic overhaul of federal education policy, including dismantling the Department of Education, promoting universal private school choice, changing civil rights posture in schools, and pursuing major shifts in higher education policy. Brookings also noted that some of the biggest moves would require Congress, meaning not every proposal is equally easy to implement. But the point is not whether every line can happen overnight. The point is that the direction is clear. Less federal educational oversight, less emphasis on equity, more privatization pressure, and a redefinition of whose rights and history matter in the classroom. And Black families already know what unequal education looks like. We know what it means to send children into underfunded schools, to fight for fair discipline, to fight for advanced placement access, to fight for special education protection, to fight for textbooks that tell the truth, and to fight for Black history not to be treated like a political infection. So when a policy document talks about cutting federal education power while also pushing aggressive culture war restrictions around curriculum, race, and gender, Black parents do not hear that as abstract reform. They hear the possibility that fragile protections could be stripped while old inequities remain firmly in place. The Legal Defense Fund's Thurgood Marshall Institute warned that Project 2025 would limit access to quality education for Black students by dismantling the Department of Education, attacking truthful teaching in schools and libraries, and making higher education less accessible through privatization and the rollback of student loan relief. Again, that is an advocacy analysis, and we should name it honestly. But it is grounded in the actual proposals and in the real history of how Black students have been affected whenever public education is weakened and opportunity is redistributed upward instead of outward. Then there is healthcare, where ideology becomes intensely personal very fast. Reuters reported that Project 2025 includes proposals around abortion pill enforcement and broader reproductive restrictions. The BBC noted that the document does not explicitly call for a nationwide abortion ban, but does propose actions such as withdrawing mifepristone from the market and using existing laws more aggressively to restrict distribution by mail. The NAACP warned that Project 2025 proposes repealing the Affordable Care Act, reducing Medicaid funding, and eliminating programs aimed at addressing health disparities. The LDF likewise warned that Black communities, and especially Black women, could be hit hard by restrictions on reproductive health care and broader health access rollbacks. And this is where Black America has to hear the issue with clarity. In this country, Black women already face disproportionately high maternal mortality rates. Black families already navigate health systems marked by unequal access, unequal treatment, and unequal outcomes. So when reproductive policy becomes more punitive, when public health disparities are treated like ideological inconveniences, and when safety net structures are threatened, the burden does not fall evenly across the map. It lands where vulnerability already lives. It lands in communities that have never had the luxury of assuming the healthcare system will catch them when they fall. Then comes housing, and housing is never just about buildings. Housing is about neighborhood stability, children's schools, access to transit, exposure to pollution, accumulated wealth, and whether a family can breathe without the constant fear of displacement. The LDF warned that Project 2025 could jeopardize Black families' access to affordable housing by shifting control of key housing programs, including Section 8-related systems, toward states, including states with long histories of racial discrimination. That matters because Black housing insecurity in America did not happen by accident. It was manufactured through policy, redlining, exclusionary zoning, discriminatory appraisals, predatory lending, Urban removal dressed up as urban renewal. So when federal housing protections are loosened or made more uneven, Black communities are not imagining a hypothetical threat. They are remembering a pattern. And if you pull back even further, you can see the safety net question underneath all of this. Heritage's own document includes support for work requirements in food assistance and a broader philosophy of reducing the federal role in social welfare while shifting more responsibility to states, families, and private structures. Critics argue that this kind of approach sounds morally tidy from a distance, but often becomes brutally uneven in practice, especially in communities already carrying the weight of wage inequality, health disparities, caregiving burdens, and unstable housing costs. The NAACP warned that reductions in welfare support and regulatory protections would disproportionately harm Black communities. The dispute here is not whether the plan contains a conservative vision of personal responsibility. It clearly does. The real question is what happens when that vision meets people already surviving structural disadvantage. This is also where environmental justice enters the picture, because for Black America, environment is not a luxury topic. It is asthma rates, lead exposure, flood vulnerability, refinery zones, drinking water, and whether poor Black neighborhoods are treated as expendable. The LDF warned that by shutting down environmental justice infrastructure, Project 2025 could intensify health disparities caused by environmental racism. That may sound like a niche issue until you remember how often Black communities are placed nearest to danger and farthest from remedy. So this section is not really about policy categories. It is about the Black everyday. It is about the mother trying to figure out whether her child's school will still protect his rights. It is about the grandmother relying on stable medication access and health coverage. It is about the young family hoping a housing voucher or affordable unit keeps them from falling into chaos. It is about the student wondering whether college will move closer or farther away. It is about the worker whose federal job has anchored an entire household. It is about the church that keeps stepping in to feed, counsel, transport, mentor, and bury people when public systems fail. And that is why Black audiences cannot afford to let this conversation stay abstract. Because when powerful people redesign the state, they do not usually feel the first tremors. The people at the top still have options. They have savings, networks, legal representation, mobility, and insulation. It is ordinary people who feel reform as interruption. It is ordinary people who feel ideological experiments as rent pressure, school confusion, medical delay, and 1,000 small humiliations. That is how national agendas become local suffering. The biblical weight of this is impossible to ignore. The prophets judged nations not only by military power or religious language, but by how they treated widows, children, workers, strangers, and the poor. Scripture keeps dragging us back to the same moral standard. What kind of community are you building, and who gets crushed beneath it? That is why this is not merely a partisan fight. It is a moral question about the structure of care, the distribution of burden, and the meaning of justice in public life. And once you see how deeply these proposals could touch schoolrooms, hospitals, housing offices, food budgets, and family stability, another question rises to the surface with even greater force. If the everyday fallout could be this personal, this immediate, and this unequal, then why would the Black church treat this like somebody else's policy fight instead of a spiritual and communal emergency unfolding in real time? By the time a story reaches this point, some people will still try to reduce it to a political argument and move on. They will say this is just policy. They will say this is just another election cycle. They will say the church should stay in its lane, preach the gospel, pray for the nation, and avoid getting entangled in what they call worldly affairs. But for the Black church, that kind of separation has never really existed. It has never been historically honest, and it has never been spiritually complete, because the Black church in America was never only a worship space. It was a refuge, a schoolhouse, a meeting hall, a communication network, a financial support system, a grief center, a freedom drum, and sometimes the only institution Black people could fully call their own. That is why a policy agenda like Project 2025 cannot be treated as somebody else's fight. If the proposals we have been discussing reach into education, civil rights enforcement, voting protections, healthcare, housing, environmental justice, and the federal workforce, then they are already reaching into the lived reality of church members. They are reaching into choir stands, prayer lists, deacon boards, youth ministries, widows' funds, scholarship drives, food pantries, counseling offices, and funeral rows. The Black church does not minister to abstract people. It ministers to people whose rent is due, whose blood pressure medicine matters, whose children are in public schools, whose jobs depend on stable institutions, and whose dignity is often negotiated in systems they did not design. This is why silence can become a form of surrender, not because every pastor has to become a pundit, not because every sermon has to become a policy lecture, but because there are moments when spiritual leadership requires naming the times accurately. The sons of Issachar in Scripture were honored because they understood the times and knew what Israel ought to do. That matters here. Discernment is not panic. Discernment is not partisanship. Discernment is the holy ability to recognize when changes in law, power, and public policy are carrying moral consequences that the people of God cannot afford to ignore. And the Black church has seen this before. It has seen moments when polite religion was asked to stay quiet while injustice reorganized society. It has seen what happens when Christians are told to keep faith private while children are denied equal schooling, while workers are denied equal pay, while neighborhoods are stripped of value, while voting is obstructed, and while public language gets cleaner even as public outcomes get crueler. The Black church knows that oppression does not always come wearing a hood. Sometimes it comes carrying legislation, court arguments, budget proposals, personnel changes, and respectable talking points about order and tradition. That is why the moral stakes here are larger than party labels. If Black Christians believe that every human being bears the image of God, then policies that weaken the practical defense of dignity are spiritually relevant. If Black Christians believe that justice matters to God, then efforts to hollow out civil rights enforcement are spiritually relevant. If Black Christians believe that truth matters, then attempts to erase history, suppress uncomfortable realities, or redefine injustice so narrowly that suffering becomes invisible are spiritually relevant. And if Black Christians believe the church is called to defend the vulnerable, then policy shifts that intensify pressure on the poor, the sick, the elderly, the student, the worker, and the politically marginalized are spiritually relevant.